Da Vinci's Ghost, Genius, Obsession, and How Leonardo Created the World in His Own Image, by Toby Lester. Narrated by Stephen Hoye. Copyright 2012 by Toby Lester. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Toby Lester and the Saghalin Literary Agency, and was produced in the year 2012 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Preface. This is the story of the world's most famous drawing, Leonardo da Vinci's Man in a Circle and a Square. Art historians call it Vitruvian Man, because it's based on a description of human proportions written some 2,000 years ago by the Roman architect Vitruvius. But not everybody knows that name. When I mention it to people, they often react with a blank stare until I start to describe the picture. Then invariably their eyes light up with the spark of recognition. "Wait," one person said to me, "the guy doing naked jumping jacks?" Call it whatever you like, but you know the picture. It's everywhere, deployed variously to celebrate all sorts of ideas. The grandeur of art, the nature of well-being, the power of geometry and mathematics, the ideals of the Renaissance, the beauty of the human body, the creative potential of the human mind, the universality of the human spirit, and more. It figures prominently in the symbology of the Da Vinci Code, and has been spoofed gloriously on The Simpsons. It shows up on coffee cups and T-shirts, on book covers and billboards, in movies and online, on corporate and scientific logos, on international spacecraft. It even appears on the Italian €1 coin, guaranteeing that each day millions of people will hold it in their hands. In short, it's a worldwide icon of undeniable reach and appeal. But almost nobody knows its story. I first began to get interested in that story while at work on my previous book, The Fourth Part of the World, 2009, which tells the story of the remarkable map that in 1507 gave America its name. In writing that book, I delved deep into the weird and wonderful world of early maps, geographical ideas, and visions of the cosmos. And one day I stumbled across a medieval world map that immediately grabbed my attention. What struck me about it was what strikes everybody when they first see it: its uncanny resemblance to Vitruvian Man. This map is the Lambeth Palace world map, circa 1300, inscribed in a circle and a square, Christ embodies and embraces the world. The more I studied medieval manuscripts, the more I came across similar images, in maps of the world, diagrams of the cosmos, guides to the constellations, astrological charts, medical illustrations, and more. Leonardo, I began to realize, hadn't conjured up Vitruvian Man out of the blue. The figure had a long line of predecessors. I discussed Vitruvian Man briefly in The Fourth Part of the World, in the context of medieval and Renaissance mapping. The picture occupied only a peripheral place in the story I was telling, and soon I had to leave it behind. But as I moved forward, I found myself glancing back in my mental rearview mirror at the receding form of Vitruvian Man. What else might be embedded in that picture? What forgotten worlds might it contain? What sort of a window on Leonardo and his times might it provide? Why had nobody ever tried to tell the picture's story? Soon enough I was hooked, and the result, some 2 years later, was this book. On the surface, the story seems straightforward enough. Writing at the dawn of the Roman imperial age, Vitruvius proposed that a man can be made to fit inside a circle and a square, and some 1,500 years later, Leonardo gave that idea memorable visual form. But there's much more to the story than that. Vitruvius had described his figure in an architectural context, insisting that the proportions of sacred temples should conform to the proportions of the ideal human body, the design of which, he believed, conformed to the hidden geometry of the universe. Hence the importance of the circle and the square. Ancient philosophers, mathematicians, and mystics had long invested those two shapes with special symbolic powers. The circle represented the cosmic and the divine. The square represented the earthly and the secular. Anybody proposing that a man could be made to fit inside both shapes was therefore making an age-old metaphysical statement. The human body wasn't just designed according to the principles that governed the world. It was the world, in miniature. To an almost astonishing degree, this idea, known as the theory of the microcosm, was the engine that had powered European religious, scientific, and artistic thought for centuries, and in the late 15th century Leonardo hitched himself to it in no uncertain terms. If the design of the human body really did reflect that of the cosmos, he reasoned, then by studying it more carefully than had ever been done before, by using his unparalleled powers of observation to peer deep into his own nature, he might expand the scope of his art to include the broadest of metaphysical horizons. By examining himself in minute detail, he might see and understand the world as a whole. Vitruvian Man sums up that dream in powerful visual form. At a superficial level, the picture is simply a study of individual proportions, but it's also something far more subtle and complex. It's a profound act of philosophical speculation. It's an idealized self-portrait, in which Leonardo, stripped down to his essence, takes his own measure, and in doing so embodies a timeless human hope, that we just might have the power of mind to figure out how we fit into the grand scheme of things. The story of Vitruvian Man is actually two stories, one individual and one collective. The individual story, of course, is Leonardo's own. Set in the years immediately leading up to 1490, it's the story, as best I've been able to reconstruct it, of how Leonardo came to draw his famous picture, and it's a surprisingly unfamiliar tale. Like Vitruvian Man, Leonardo himself has become such a popular icon, deployed for so many different purposes, that he's rarely encountered as an actual person. Instead, he's almost entirely a creature of myth, a prophetic magus-like figure invested with almost superhuman traits, who completely transcended his age. As one modern historian has put it, echoing the words of countless others, Leonardo, the complete man of the Renaissance, paces forth, as far removed from medieval man as imagination can conceive. But that's not the figure you'll encounter in this book. The Leonardo who drew Vitruvian Man turns out to be every bit as medieval and derivative as he is modern and visionary, and he's all the more complex, fascinating, and mysterious for that. The second story unfolds on a much broader scale. It's the story of how Vitruvian Man first came into being as an idea more than 2,000 years ago, and then slowly made its way across the centuries toward its fateful encounter with Leonardo. It's a saga of grand proportions, spanning centuries, continents, and disciplines, in which people and events and ideas tumble into and out of view. The architect Vitruvius, age-old theories of the cosmos, ancient Greek sculptors, the Emperor Augustus, Roman land surveying techniques, the idea of empire, early Christian geometrical symbolism, the mystical visions of Hildegard of Bingen, Europe's great cathedrals, Islamic ideas of the microcosm, art workshops in Florence, Brunelleschi's dome, the humanists of Italy, court life in Milan, human dissections, Renaissance architectural theory, and much more. At times the story ranges far afield, but never, I hope, without good reason. Each new episode and each new chapter is designed to help put Leonardo and his picture into deeper perspective. By definition, the two stories start out at a considerable remove from each other. I've constructed them in very different ways, one as a personal story, told at the ground level, and the other as a story of ideas, surveyed from a considerable altitude. But as the book progresses, the two slowly wrap themselves around each other until, in the final chapter, they become one and the same. This way, please. One damp, cold morning in March, a security guard at the Galleria dell'Accademia in Venice asked me to follow her through the museum's grand exhibit halls. For almost 200 years the Accademia has owned Vitruvian Man, and I had come to see it in person. Off we went. Without once looking back, the guard strode purposefully through room after room, weaving her way through packs of museum visitors, gazing at some of the most celebrated paintings in the history of Italian art. I scurried to keep up. Eventually we reached the back of the museum, where we were met by another guard. He asked us to wait while he radioed ahead for clearance, then directed us into a cordoned-off stairwell and waved us upward. Vitruvian Man only very rarely appears on display at the Accademia. Most of the time the picture is kept out of harm's way in a climate-controlled archive not accessible to the general public. To see it, you have to request special permission from the director of the museum's Office of Drawings and Prints, Dr. Annalisa Parisi-Torini, who, if she deems your request worthy, will guardedly schedule a private viewing. When at last I was ushered into the archive, I found her waiting for me. We greeted each other and made pleasant small talk for a short while. Then, moving to a nearby display table, we got down to business. Dr. Parisi-Torini donned a pair of slightly tattered white cotton gloves and asked me to do the same. She walked over to a bank of flat file drawers, slid one open, and lifted out a manila conservation folder, which she carried back and gingerly placed on the table. Straightening up, she looked over at me. "Okay," she said, a smile creeping onto her face. "Are you ready?" Man is a model of the world. Leonardo da Vinci, circa 1480. Prologue, 1490. On June 18, 1490, a small group of travelers set out from Milan for the university town of Pavia, some 25 miles to the south. A well-worn road connected the two cities, and the journey promised to be a pleasant one, a late spring saunter across the verdant Lombard plain. The trip lasted several hours. Riding past clover-strewn meadows, shady stands of poplars, and farmland crisscrossed with irrigation canals, the travelers had plenty of time to take in the scenery, soak up the country air, and make easy conversation. When at last they reached Pavia, they brought their horses to a clattering halt in front of an inn called Il Saracino. The innkeeper, Giovanni Agostino Berneri, must have rushed out to greet his new guests. Two of them, after all, had been summoned to Pavia by none other than Ludovico Sforza, the self-proclaimed Duke of Milan, whose dominion extended to Pavia and far beyond. The Duke had visited Pavia not long before, and on June 8th, after surveying the construction of the town's new cathedral, which he had commissioned just 2 years earlier, he had relayed a request to his personal secretary in Milan. "The building supervisors of this city's cathedral have asked and made pressing requests," he wrote, "that we agree to provide them with that Sienese engineer employed by the building supervisors of the cathedral in Milan. You must talk to this engineer and arrange that he come here to see this building." The engineer in question was Francesco di Giorgio Martini, one of the most famous architects of his day, who at the time was in Milan studying plans for the design of the Tiburio, or domed crossing tower, soon to be built in the city's unfinished cathedral. But in a postscript to his letter the Duke asked that 2 experts of his own choosing also be sent. One was Giovanni Antonio Amadeo, a well-known local architect who was working on the Tiburio with Francesco and had received other commissions from the Duke. The other was a much less obvious choice, a 38-year-old Florentine painter and sculptor based in Milan who had no experience as a practicing architect. In his letter the Duke called him Master Leonardo of Florence, but he's known today by a different name, Leonardo da Vinci. The Duke's secretary dutifully looked into the matter and responded 2 days later. Francesco, he reported, had more work to do, but would be able to leave Milan in 8 days. Amadeo couldn't join him, because he was involved in an important project on Lake Como, but Leonardo, he said, had expressed great interest in accompanying Francesco to Pavia. Master Leonardo the Florentine, he wrote, is always ready whenever he is asked. If you send the Sienese engineer, he will come too. Not long afterward, Francesco of Siena and Leonardo of Florence set out for Pavia, accompanied by a small group of colleagues and attendants. Had anybody travelling with the group that day been asked which of the two men would still be remembered 500 years later, the answer would have seemed obvious: the great Francesco. Even by the middle of the 16th century, he was already being said to have contributed more to the development of Italian architecture than anybody since the legendary Filippo Brunelleschi. Francesco's reputation stemmed from his accomplishments not only as a prolific master-builder, but also as an author and a graphic artist. His illustrated treatises were copied more often during the 15th and 16th century than those of any other artist. By the time he came to Milan in 1490, he was perhaps the most sought-after architectural consultant in all of Italy. That year alone he travelled from Siena to Bologna, Bracciano, Milan, and Urbino to discuss building projects, and to Pavia, of course, in the company of Leonardo, whose legacy as an artist and engineer would soon eclipse his own. One of the earliest surviving descriptions of Leonardo, based on the recollections of a painter who knew him personally in Milan, provides an idea of what he looked like when he and Francesco set out for Pavia. He was very attractive, the description reads, well-proportioned, graceful, and good-looking. He wore a short, rose-pink tunic, knee-length, at a time when most people wore long gowns. He had beautiful curling hair, carefully styled, which came down to the middle of his chest. This already is a largely forgotten Leonardo, not the pensive, bearded elder of legend, but a much younger man, still busily fashioning his own image. If any of this provoked doubts in Francesco about his travelling companion, they can't have lasted long. According to another artist who knew him, Leonardo was by nature very courteous, cultivated, and generous, a genial person to spend time with. He was so pleasing in conversation, one of his earliest biographers records, that he won all hearts. Leonardo may well have revealed another side of his personality to Francesco as the two men settled into their journey, his passion for jokes. In his private notebooks he recorded scores of them, many of which involve a kind of inside humor that might have worked to break the ice with a fellow artist. It was asked of a painter why, one of them went, since he made such beautiful figures, which were but dead things, his children were so ugly. To which the painter replied that he made his pictures by day, and his children by night. Francesco would quickly have recognized that Leonardo was no court dandy. He would have noticed, for one thing, how Leonardo never stopped scanning his surroundings for scenes of artistic interest. From the dawning of the day, Leonardo later wrote, the air is filled with countless images for which the eye acts as magnet. Whenever something caught his eye, he would compulsively open a small notebook that he wore hanging from his belt and begin sketching furiously, with almost mind-boggling virtuosity. He loved his tiny sketchbook, and recommended that all serious artists carry one. As you go about, he wrote, constantly observe, note, and consider the circumstances and behavior of men as they talk and quarrel, or laugh, or come to blows. The actions of the men themselves, and the bystanders who intervene or look on. And take note of them with rapid strokes, thus, in a little book that you should always carry with you. These things should not be rubbed out, but preserved with great care, for the forms and positions of objects are so infinite that the memory is incapable of retaining them. One can imagine Leonardo en route to Pavia, explaining the function of his notebook to Francesco in similar terms, and suggesting that he too consider wearing one on his belt. Francesco would also soon have noticed that Leonardo's mind roved every bit as much as his eye. At court in Milan, Leonardo was both renowned and mocked for the all-consuming gyre of his interests, and for the doggedness with which, whenever his thoughts fastened temporarily on a subject, he sought out experts and texts that might help him understand it. The year before he traveled to Pavia with Francesco, for example, he jotted down a collection of notes to himself that, like a nighttime flash of lightning in a jungle, momentarily illuminate a mental landscape absolutely teeming with life. The Measurement of Milan and Suburbs, a book that treats of Milan and its churches, which is to be had at the stationer's on the way to Corduzio. The Measurement of the Cortevecchio, a courtyard in the Duke's palace. The Measurement of the Castello, the Duke's palace itself. Get the master of arithmetic, probably an accountant, to show you how to square a triangle. Get Messer Fazio, a professor of medicine and law in Pavia, to show you about proportion. Get the Brera friar at a Benedictine monastery in Milan to show you De Ponderibus, a medieval text on mechanics. Giannino, the bombardier, regarding the means by which the Tower of Ferrara is walled without loopholes. Ask Maestro Antonio how mortars are positioned on bastions by day or night. Ask Benedetto Portinari, a Florentine merchant, by what means they go on ice in Flanders. The Measurement of the Sun, promised me by Maestro Giovanni Francesi, probably the French diplomat and art theorist Jean Pellerin. The Crossbow of Maestro Gianetto, the book by Giovanni Taverna that Messer Fazio has. Draw Milan. Find a master of hydraulics, and get him to tell you how to repair a lock, canal, and mill in the Lombard manner. Try to get Vitelloni, the medieval author of a text on optics, which is in the library at Pavia, and which deals with mathematics. Pagolino Scarpellino, called Asiolo, has great knowledge of waterworks. These notes reveal Leonardo in his perpetually ravenous information-gathering mode. Benedictine monks, obscure medieval treatises, university professors, popular guidebooks, accountants, itinerant merchants, doctors, foreign diplomats, artillerymen, military engineers, waterworks experts, all are fair game to him as he hunts for information about subjects that interest him. The notes also help explain why Leonardo so eagerly agreed to travel with Francesco to Pavia in 1490. He clearly considered the town itself a valuable source of experts and books that he needed to consult. And what better person to ply with questions about the many subjects he had ranged over in his notes than Francesco, one of Italy's greatest architects, military engineers, and hydraulics experts. Leonardo's mind must have raced at the thought of having the eminent man almost to himself for several days. The two could even discuss plans for the Cathedral Tiburio that Francesco had come to Milan to work on. Leonardo himself had recently proposed to the overseers that he be the one to build the structure, and had submitted to them a model of how he proposed to do it. Small wonder, then, that after receiving his summons to Pavia, he made it clear he would be happy to go, if Francesco would be going too. He had a lot he wanted to discuss with the Sienese engineer. Today, just one book survives that is known to have belonged to Leonardo, a lavishly illustrated manuscript titled Treatise on Architecture, Engineering, and the Art of War, by none other than Francesco di Giorgio Martini. Leonardo's copy of the work, which contains illustrations by Francesco himself, dates from the early 1480s. He probably acquired the work only after Francesco's death in 1502, but Francesco was actively working on revisions to the text in 1490, and may well have taken it with him to Milan and Pavia. The treatise is a rambling summary of Francesco's early thoughts on architectural theory and practice. As such, it's the best available guide to the ideas that he and Leonardo probably discussed during their time together. Written in an unpolished vernacular Italian that suggests its audience was builders, engineers, and military officers rather than literary men, the work ranges over a number of the subjects that were preoccupying Leonardo in 1490. Geometry and surveying, the design of cities, fortresses, and harbors, hydraulics, building styles for temples, palaces, theaters, and homes, and a variety of ingenious pumps, hoists, cranks, military machines, and other mechanical devices. It's easy to imagine the scene. After much discussion en route from Milan to Pavia, Leonardo and Francesco sit down together in their quarters at Il Saracino and begin poring over the treatise. Or perhaps Francesco, badgered to exhaustion by Leonardo's relentless questioning, announces after dinner that he will be retiring for the evening, and in lieu of answering any more questions, digs the manuscript out of his travel bag, hands it over to Leonardo, and politely suggests that he spend some time combing it for answers. In either scenario, one of Francesco's favorite ideas would have leapt out at Leonardo as soon as he began studying the work, as indeed it probably already had during their conversations. Basilicas, Francesco explained at one point in the text, have the proportions and shape of the human body. But Francesco didn't just state his church body analogy and move on. He drew it, too. That's because, uncommonly for his time, but in complete sympathy with Leonardo, he believed in the explanatory power of images. Without a drawing, he explained in the epilogue of his treatise, one cannot express and clarify one's idea. Such thinking led him to toy with his analogy visually, and to produce a phantasmagoric sequence of sketches in the margins of his manuscript in which architectural forms are inhabited by ghostly visions of the human body. In his treatise, Francesco applied this human analogy to everything from individual columns to entire cities. The human body, after all, had been created in God's own image, which meant that it could and should be considered to contain a kind of source code for all harmonious design. Man, called a little world, he explained, contains in himself all the general perfections of the entire cosmos. Such ideas would have appealed enormously to Leonardo, who since at least 1487 had been rigorously pursuing the study of the human body and human proportions, and investigating the relationship between anatomy and architecture. His investigations, he was coming to believe, would allow him to move beyond surface questions of function and design, and ultimately arrive at an understanding of first principles, at which point he would be able to resolve all sorts of artistic problems, scholarly misapprehensions, engineering challenges, and even philosophical mysteries. So what Francesco declared in the opening paragraph of his treatise was music to Leonardo's ears. All the arts and all rules, he wrote, are derived from a well-composed and proportioned human body. This was an idea much discussed in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, for both its practical applications and symbolic resonances. Famously, it derived from an obscure treatise on the art of building, an ancient Latin work, much more talked about than read. Highly technical, inexpertly written, and bristling with ancient Greek architectural terminology, the treatise had reached the 15th century corrupted by centuries of scribble errors and omissions, which made it inaccessible to all but a few scholars and architectural theorists, and even they tended to throw up their hands when asked to make sense of the treatise and its author. As far as we are concerned, despaired the great Florentine humanist Leon Battista Alberti, one of the first to comb methodically through the text in the mid-15th century, he might just as well not have written at all. A 14th-century copy of the work survived in the magnificent Visconti Library in Pavia, which Leonardo planned to visit while in town on his consulting trip. In the confused mangling of a scribe, the manuscript was identified there simply as Vitruvius de Architectritis, but Leonardo and Francesco both knew better. The work's real title was De Architectura Libri Decem, or 10 Books on Architecture, and its author was a Roman architect and military engineer who had written it some 20 years before the birth of Christ. His name was Vitruvius. 1. Body of Empire. I have gathered what I observed to be useful and brought it together as a single body. Vitruvius, 10 Books on Architecture, circa 25 B.C. Marcus Vitruvius Pollio was an army man, a cog in the great lumbering Roman war machine. For years, assigned to the staff of Julius Caesar and other generals, He rumbled around Italy and the provinces, transporting equipment, fording rivers, pitching camps, digging ditches, sinking wells, constructing catapults.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?